Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm Ellie, co-director of DIAG, Democrats for an Informed Approach to Gender. And joining me today is co-director Eliza. DIAG is a 501c3 nonprofit organization of lifelong Democratic voters working to depoliticize and shed light on the ideologically driven medical scandal and the associated harms that have resulted from the adoption of gender ideology. We're building a movement to shift the prevailing narrative around the experimental, dangerous medical practices that comprise sex trait modification, euphemistically known as gender-affirming care, and to clear the path for a safer, saner, evidence-based response to gender distress. Please visit our website at diag.org. That's di-ag.org. And new to our website this month is our merch store. We've got some great merchandise to show the world that you're now politically homeless. And there's also a way for DIAG supporters to contribute to the work we're doing via our donate button. So please visit our website if you haven't been there in a while. There's some changes and more changes to come. DIAG believes in the liberal value of free speech and open discussion, which is part of why we host these spaces, to invite conversation on topics that have been left out of the public discourse.
You handing it over to me now?
I am handing.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. We are so honored to be joined by investigative authors and journalists, Gerald and Trisha Posner today. Gerald Posner has written 13 books, including Case Closed, an examination of the available evidence on the assassination of JFK, a finalist for the Pulitzer in History, and Why America Slept, the failure to prevent 9/11, the first definitive account of what really happened behind the scenes with intelligence services and government leaders during the time preceding 9/11. Both Case Closed and Why America Slept were New York Times bestsellers. Trisha Posner is currently executive director of Anti-Semitism Watch, a nonpartisan nonprofit with the goal of calling out anti-Jewish hatred on both the right and the left. She's the author of 2 books, This Is Not Your Mother's Menopause, and The Pharmacist of Auschwitz, which reached number 6 on the Wall Street Journal bestseller list. And she has worked closely with her husband on each of his 13 books. Welcome, Gerald and Trisha. We're so happy to have you. I wonder if we could start with you both giving our listeners a little background for those who aren't familiar with your writing and the kind of exhaustive research you've done. And tell us how you first became aware of the gender medicine scandal.
Sure. Hi, Eliza. Thanks so much. And thanks, Ellie, for having us. Trisha's
Yes,
here.
I'm here. Thank you for having us.
We're sort of sharing the same phone. We share the same projects. What I mean is, over time, since the 1980s, we get a project that we're excited about, and sometimes it finds us, like 9/11. We were living in New York at the time, or the first book that I ended up doing, and Trisha did the research with me on Joseph Mengele, the Nazi doctor. When I was a lawyer, it seems like in another life I was representing twins who had been experimented on at Auschwitz in a pro bono suit to try to get them some extra compensation from the German government for what they spent every year on thousands of dollars just to deaden the pain of what had been done to them.
You were helping one particular survivor, Mark Berkowitz.
Yeah, Mark Berkowitz. So sometimes, projects find us. And I think, the gender and what's happening with the gender ideology and what's happening to children and minors and women's rights has found us. And Trisha was the spark with it a few years ago, and has gotten me into it.
I've always been very, very aware of it because of it. In England, we're coming across the same problem with these issues, and also it was a big thing in this year's elections in England, women and women's rights. So the whole thing is kind of like a whole ball that comes together.
Yeah, I think, by the way, just as a sort of a lead-in on this, that I think of what DIAG is trying to do. Every time I would see tweets or posts or articles from friends of ours, because Trisha is originally from London, who were Labour Party supporters, but absolutely in distress about Labour Party stance on women and gender and not knowing. Some people had voted for Labour all their life and not knowing what to do. They felt as though the party had abandoned them. And I thought many times back to, the way many progressives and Democrats feel when talking about gender.
And it's definitely gone that way now in England. A lot of people that are in important positions are not going to say what is a woman. They will not say it. It's really quite bizarre and scary.
Yeah.
It's the same. And with the children as well. There was a really huge case a few years ago, I think it was about 7 years ago, where they wouldn't let the children in school unless they wore trousers.
Yeah, it was the start of sort of the gender.
It was the start of the gender.
And just one last thing on this long answer to your very short question. We like to do things where we propose to a publisher sometimes a book idea, and we say, let us go off for a few years and see what we find. And we did that with a book on the Vatican. Trisha did it with her book on the pharmacists of Auschwitz. They let us go off for a while and really come up with something. And the same thing happened with a book on pharma, the last book, much of it about the opioid crisis. We have found in the last year or so that's not possible when it comes to gender.
No. Absolutely not.
We even changed an agent from a New York agent to someone in London, because you go to a publisher and you say, by the way, we'd like to follow the money. We'd like to see what's going on in the gender industry or that. And they want to know what your conclusion is before they sign the book, because they don't want to get a manuscript back 18 months or 2 years later that they think, how can we publish this? Because people inside our own publishing house may hate it, or it runs against a progressive ideology. It's the first time we've really run into what I call sort of this unsaid wall of, we want to know what you're going to conclude before you do your research, which isn't the way we can do it.
Which isn't really research, is it?
No, absolutely not. Because the whole thing has been politicized. So if you even say one word, if you criticize it in any way, shape, or form, then you're a Republican or Trumpster.
Right.
So it's been politicized. And I used to be a registered Democrat. I'm now an independent. So I feel like an orphan at the moment.
Yeah, and I was a registered Democrat for many years and also an independent. And it is true what Trisha said, by the way. She did a piece a few years ago in the Wall Street Journal as an op-ed, when did woman become a dirty word, about the degendering in medical language about women. I did a piece about puberty blockers in the Wall Street Journal about a year ago, and both of us received a lot of pushback from progressive friends that said, you must be, totally Republicans ready to pass laws on this and that. And you immediately get categorized when it comes to gender. It's a knee-jerk response, and that's why I think what DIAG is doing is potentially so important, because you're trying to open the eyes of the party.
Because they've created this thing where it's almost Orwellian, where it's become one think and one speak, and 2 and 2 is 5. And we're both very outspoken, so I have an opinion, and I'm not going to be shut down because they think they're going to scare you by calling you a Trump-S or whatever,
transphobic or whatever.
Yeah. Well, and I want, later we definitely want to explore a little bit more about what it's like trying to be a journalist or a researcher on this topic, and sort of the shutting down of open discourse and free speech. But I wanted to go back to your, when did woman become a dirty word? I just read today about a Massachusetts bill that's going to remove all gendered language from laws related to birth. If passed, all references for male and female would be erased. And I think this movement has so cleverly used changes in language as a weapon to push the ideology further into the culture. And, as writers, you both really understand the power of words. You've both written on this topic. What are your views about the role language has played, not just around the word woman, but around this whole movement, and how do we get back to reality-based language?
I think one of the biggest problems is that people are, I hate to say this, are scared, even though they know it's just not rational. And it's just not that. When you say in the NHS and Natural Health in England now, that a vagina is a frontal hole. Could you think of anything more disgusting than that? I mean, it's crazy talk. And why? Because apparently it will offend a person who's transitioning. And what about my feelings? What about women's feelings? I mean, I cannot believe that I've come all this way from my mother and my grandparents chaining themselves up for our freedom of right and speech. And this is where I don't understand, because I do believe that most people, when they hear this, think it's absolutely bonkers, but they're just too afraid.
I do think that there is a fear, and part of that fear, though, is caused not just by the change in language in terms of, let's say, degendering language, like you wrote about, Trisha, but I think it's also what you were just saying, Eliza, is the idea that bills, legislation, idea is cast immediately in a way that if people don't study the field, don't understand much about it, they think that if they align with that side, they are really aligning with the discriminatory process. What I mean by that is bills that pass, let's say, in red states that say no hormones or puberty blockers below the age of 18 are covered in the important part of the legacy press, New York Times, Washington Post, everywhere else, as anti-trans legislation. So it's not covered as something that protects children. It could just as easily be turned around and said that it's protecting children, but it immediately becomes anti-trans legislation. In California, where parents fail to get the number of required signatures to put on the ballot, a resolution that would have required schools to tell parents if in fact children expressed a desire to change at schools, that was actually put on the ballot. The state put it on as an anti-trans, discriminatory proposal. So language is important.
But how did we get here? How did we allow this to happen? I mean, I think there are so many people out there that have no idea what's really going on behind the curtain.
I agree with that.
They have no idea. I mean, journalists, people like yourself, people that have children in this situation. I think most of the people I ever have, like even just Title IX to talk about, they don't know. They're not aware. They're not informed.
But one last very quick thing, when you talk about language and how powerful it is and how it's used often in terms of making sure, even the idea of gender affirming care, right? The idea that what you're doing is affirming somebody's gender that's incorrect. The very language even behind that. And I think that one of the things that has happened is there is no doubt that there are extremes on this, just as there is in a country. We're split into these political extremes, these two very, very far apart camps often. And there are extremes when it comes to gender ideology. And the people lost in the middle are parents and children, because it's hard to have a reasonable discussion about it. That's right. Absolutely. A discourse in which you get a couple of people, you disagree on some issues, and you have an old-fashioned debate, and you exchange ideas, and at the end, you may not convince anybody or change their minds, but you aren't screaming at each other. That's increasingly hard to have on this topic.
Very hard.
Yes, so true. And I mean, it almost sounds like you're saying that, people have been sort of bamboozled by some of these slogans that, the gender affirming care, or Amy Souza calls it thought terminating mantras, that you just say that to yourself, and then you're sure that you're on the right side of history. And I'm so surprised. I guess I still wake up every morning surprised that the left has seemingly abandoned women's rights so eagerly and rapidly, and maybe part of that is the language piece, because it's been packaged very nicely.
Well, when you think about it, if the Title IX, which was predominantly for women in sports, if they do change the language, that will mean that any man with a penis that identifies as a woman will be allowed in women's spaces. Now, I'm using this, and the end of women's, and I'm using this from what's her name, the Australian woman. She used this. It was her quote. She said, "Good men do not go in women's spaces."
Sal.
Yeah. She said, they just don't. So, what is this all about? I mean, this is just, it's like sexualizing children. It's just so, as you said, it's so bonkers. It's really mad.
But there was a time that Trisha in particular was distressed. We would talk about this in the morning. It's our morning discussion around breakfast of that. And she would wonder, where are the leaders of the women's movement?
Where
That's
are
right.
they?
But then in the end, I think that we can't rely on them just automatically to come up and fight it. And I do think that in many cases, whether we're talking about an earlier generation in terms of Jane Fonda and Gloria Steinem and everything else, I understand that, but I do think they're scared, not scared, scared's the wrong word, but they stay away from the field because they do think that it's discriminatory to sort of punch down, as I've heard that said.
But they're losing their rights. I mean, they come out in full-blown force for women's choice, which I'm absolutely in favor for, but they don't come out to help us as women, as everything is just being scrubbed away. I don't. There
isn't a race. I mean, it sounds like it's overly dramatic to say it, and I know Trish said in her op-ed about erasing women. It seems as though she felt she was being erased in terms of language of that, but there is something to that.
I did say in the piece also, why can't we coexist? Why can't you have your language and I can still be a woman with breasts and the vagina and ovaries and uterus, etc. But that they don't want that. They want that all erased. It really is not normal. I mean, it's simple.
I want to jump in. That what comes as part and parcel of this that I find really concerning is that, if you set these rules up about language, you have to find ways to enforce them. And, what that means for us as a democracy is
scary,
really terrifying.
Yeah, scary. You're absolutely right. It's really, I have said this to Gerald. This is really scary. So I say it's very Orwellian. I mean, it's very scary. I don't think, if I would be having this conversation maybe 10, 20 years ago, I would say, you're bonkers. That could never happen. Yeah, we don't have any children, by the way, so we're fighting for everybody here. But yeah, I agree with you.
I do think, it is a great concern. You talk about big government, big brother, or that type of idea. Sometimes we feel as though, as a two-person operation, and that's what it is. There's no researchers here. There's nothing else. There's no team behind it. It's the two of us sort of trying to do it. We feel like we're putting a finger in the dike, stopping that leak, and then something else is coming up. I remember, last year when the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, ostensibly a bipartisan federal agency, is sort of responsible for investigating complaints about employment discrimination in the workplace, had proposed new enforcement guidance that designated a failure to use someone's preferred pronouns as harassment. It's pretty amazing. You can get away with insulting somebody's religious beliefs before you can get away with necessarily misgendering somebody. And if that becomes the standard, where somebody is filing an EEOC complaint on the basis of being misgendered, we're going down a path that's not only going to be litigious and lawyers are going to love it and everything else, but we as society will lose out.
Yeah. And, I think about in 1984 where, they were removing words from the dictionary.
Yes.
Because if you took away the language for it, you could not get a concept in your head of what it was you were fighting for. And I hate to play up that Orwellian, but it's just,
it's so
really,
true.
How do you not?
No, it's just so true. It's so true. In fact, funnily enough, I just reread the book about 6 months ago, and it was like, oh my goodness, we're actually living like this.
She did read 1984 again. She had a little bit more meaning. But I also think that we talk about this. I think back to when I was a teenager growing up in San Francisco, and then went to Berkeley, or Trisha was in London growing up, and you go through that period in which not everybody does, but I went through a rebellious stage in which I wanted to sort of, be different, stand up, show that I was unique in that. And we were doing it back then in the early 70s at college of that, about Vietnam or about Laos and Cambodia or what was happening with Watergate. Now gender becomes a passing transient phase where not just kids can feel as though in this contagion, and it is a social media contagion, despite what we will read in those who say no, it's not. I'm convinced of that. But I think that even those who want to stand out and be different, it's the equivalent of getting a tattoo without actually getting a tattoo. It's the equivalent of driving your parents or others a little bit crazy. It's become a form of rebellion, but what a dangerous form of rebellion, because it could be permanent if it's medicalized.
But it's all rushed, they're not giving the children time to really understand, or the parents, they're rushing everything. If you suggest a shrink to have a conversation, what do they call? They call that now
conversion therapy.
Yeah, right.
I mean, I never heard of such a thing.
And so, that's so interesting. You talked before.
We changed the language.
Yeah, Eliza and Ellie, about changing language. So conversion therapy was a legitimate thing that LGB activists and those in the community were concerned about, that religious groups or others were going to try to convert people from being gay to being straight, and that therefore that should be stopped. And states have stopped that time and time again. And the T part of LGB, which added on to the movement, was very smart to pick that up as an idea. And I say smart, I don't mean as smart as I admire it. Smart in that it was a good political move, because they said, oh, by the way, any effort to question what the child says about what they innately know must be an effort not just to put up safety guardrails along the way, but must be an effort to turn them back. It's conversion therapy. And once a liberal or progressive hears that, oh my God, these laws are being passed and they want to, slow up the process for children to identify as a different gender, and it's conversion therapy, they all say, well, I'm against conversion therapy, without knowing anything else about it.
But I think, coming from my generation, I'm not going to say my age, but I'm from way back, we would use the terminology tomboy. That's what we would call me, because when people see me now, I'm very feminine. I love to dress up and makeup and that. But I was climbing trees, roller skates, hanging out with the boys. My mother would say, you'll never be able to wear a skirt because you're going to have cuts and bruises everywhere. So that stage passed with me. But I never thought I was a boy. But I just liked to do things that were very rough and tumble. I was,
Today you might be boxed into a different
and I think today I probably would have been boxed into one of these gender things.
Yeah. I think, when you talk about, kids rebelling, they're going to go goth or whatever thing, you didn't have schools and teachers, promoting it or supporting it, facilitating it. That's, that is such a different kind of
very good
world.
It's an excellent point.
No, and not only that, but I think it's very interesting that even when you were talking about, yes, goth or grunge, but then you're with the LGBT community, you were making a choice about what was your sexual inclination, how you felt, your sexual preference. You took no surgical modifications or drugs to live your life. If you were a man who said, I'm gay, or you were a woman who said, I'm gay, I'm lesbian, you could have that life without having to take drugs, modify your body, amputate body parts. Now we're talking about a situation in which to be the true self, it requires the intervention of medicine, both in terms of drugs and surgery. And the real ideologues in the group emphasize the fact that it should be done at a younger age, because the younger the age, even pre-puberty, of course, would mean that an eventual transition, which is cosmetic, you're never going to be a boy who becomes a woman nor a girl who becomes a man, but cosmetically to look like the opposite sex, the best possible woman face, if you want to call it, will be from a child who started before puberty. So now we're pushing the level down, the needle down, to a decision which we've never faced before really in human history, because science has made it possible to do things that weren't possible 70 or 80 years ago, together with an ideology that fits into it and is utilizing, I think, much to the detriment and long-term damage of many, many children.
Yeah, it's dystopian.
Yeah, dystopian. But there was there was a very famous case of the children.
Moni.
Yeah, so it doesn't work that way.
It's true that most of your listeners who may be in on this have some idea of some of the history of gender, and some may not. But in a very quick capsule, there's a very famous sexologist who started the young transgender sort of division and program at Boston, and John Money, and he had a pair of twins who were brought to him by parents, both boys, and one had physical damage to the penis, and he said, we'll sort of do surgery and raise that boy as a girl, and it was going to prove his philosophy that in fact it was all about environment. We say, what is it, genes or not, or is it environment? And he thought it was environment, and it was an unmitigated disaster for the children involved. That boy who was raised as a girl, always felt as though he was a boy, was battled depression and drugs, eventually committed suicide. The brother died as well. It's one of those stories in which it proves forever, in terms of a living experiment, that it's not just possible to change what people are biologically, but he's sort of a footnote now, because even gender ideologues and activists have abandoned him because they know that's a very, very bad example.
Doesn't fit the narrative.
Yeah, that's right.
Doesn't fit the picture.
So I'm going to ask, you've covered a range of scandals, and of course the opioid epidemic in pharma, your book, Pharma, Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America. And how does this phenomenon compare to the other scandals you've written about? What looks familiar? What looks different? Both in terms of what you've learned and about the motivations of those at the heart of the scandal.
It's a good question. It doesn't fit. It's not like putting a square peg into a square. It's not exactly right, but there are a lot of similarities. Trisha and I talk about this sometimes with the opioid epidemic, the worst prescription, most lethal prescription drug crisis in American history. In terms of this, there were a group of doctors in the 80s who started to think that opioids had been tar and feathered too much. They weren't really as addictive, and they started this opioid reevaluation program. They became the advocates for eventually saying, you know what, we should dispense opioids more liberally to treat pain. I think of them sometimes as the gender doctors, the medical professionals who come into the field, who, although I'm convinced they are wrong, and that the facts show they are wrong, if you go back to the Dutch studies and everything else, they actually are the proponents for saying there's a new form of medicine here. It is gender. They believe you can change your gender and you can do it surgically. They're the advocates for it. And then over time, pharma gets involved. So big pharma is making billions of dollars on puberty blockers and on cross-sex hormones. Once you are a client for hormones as a child, 13, 14, 15, whatever.
It's lifelong.
You're a client for life, as Trisha said. That's it. The best type of client. And the plastic surgeons have gotten involved. They are doing voice therapy, masculinization, feminization, the actual amputations, the full penises, the full vaginas. And I think that growth of the industry feeds itself. So it happened with opioids, in that pharma fed the narrative that was being fed by these real true believers on opioids. Pharma and the medical associations are feeding that narrative again here by those what I call gender progressive medical doctors. And the additional problem that you did not have in opioids, you had it to an extent. Purdue Pharma and others created these fake patient groups and organizations that said, pain relief and that, and they were really just fronts for dispensing more opioids. Here, you have some of that going on, but the most astonishing part to me, which leaves me just, Trisha and I, there are a lot of things that get us upset, but one of the things that get us the most upset, we've written a part about this, is the American Pediatric Association, the American Psychiatric Association, Do No Harm, and other groups have called them out. the extent to which the medical associations for which we are supposed to rely for care, especially the pediatric association, has embraced standards of care which stand now increasingly isolated and alone in the United States as the rest of the world and Europe and the Western countries are moving right towards some sanity. So there are similarities to what happened. And what happened, Tricia, at the end on opioids, lawyers sort of brought justice by, and that's not very good justice. The money. They took the money, unfortunately. Those who are listening who know the opioid story know that Purdue Pharma went bankrupt, and in the billions of dollars of settlement, it's now up in the air.
And again, it's like you meet the parents of these children. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah, and
the parent side of it as well.
And I have no doubt that there will be class actions for detransitioners and others, but it's more difficult in the United States than it is in, let's say, a country like your native UK, Trish, because there you have the National Health Service. You get a rule, like on the Cass report, pediatrician, Cass had a report that talked about the dangers of puberty blockers, and as a result, the National Health Service has banned puberty blockers for minors. That's fantastic, but here it's state by state. So it might happen in Florida, it might not happen in California.
But it is amazing when you listen to the medicine they prescribe on television, and they tell you all the horrific side effects, but they never tell you about the side effects for what they're giving these children.
Yeah. No.
Never.
Because, if I can just say, one thing on that.
No, that's okay.
They have buried the side effects and the dangers and the harms under the threat of suicide.
Yeah.
That has been used to effectively silence critics, to silence parents, to say, my God, you're talking about weaker bones, and you're talking about whether, in fact, they're going to have to dilate for the rest of their lives because of a surgery. But if we don't have all of that, they're going to kill themselves. And that is the canard that is repeated time and time again without the facts to support it. It's like a drumbeat, and people believe it or they're afraid to challenge it.
Because you take it for granted that people are much more informed, but they're not as informed as you think.
Right.
And there are a lot of people that listen to the person in the white coat.
Yeah, they listen to doctors, or they listen to a 35-second TikTok video.
Yeah. Unfortunately, TikTok is very dangerous for this.
Yeah, or they listen to the Trevor Project. I mean, a lot of these organizations that they must know better about how you discuss these topics, but they violate every best practices rule and throw it out as a single cause for suicide when they know that that's not the case. But this has, I certainly don't have an explanation for it, but this has thrown everything, all caution to the wind, and it becomes about the biggest threat possible, which parents they'll fold.
And I do think that one of the things that we are all looking at in terms of, when I say we, journalists, parents, health professionals, organizations who are looking into this, I mean, we're waiting to see what the statistics look like over time, over the years on detransitioners.
They try to keep that very quiet.
Right. And of course, detransitioners, threaten the very heart of what gender ideology is about, because if you really know who you are as a child, you then get the help of the doctors and big pharma to help you transition to this new gender of yours. You should never want then to have to go through all of the difficulty of detransitioning, unless, of course, it wasn't the right choice in the first place. And this is not something like changing your mind. It's not like saying I want a pink coat and tomorrow I'll have a blue coat. I can just buy it.
But unfortunately, when the parents sit in with these consultations, they make it sound, it's been a big problem. Snip, snip, everything will be fine. They don't tell the parents any of the side effects that are going to happen.
I think a lot of parents, look, you are parents, I understand that. And I've spoken to a lot of parents, and Trish has as well. And there are parents who are, in some instances, afraid to speak up because they are worried about that suicide issue. And they also, I know that I've spoken to parents who think that if the state allows it, I know this is hard to imagine because I would never feel like this. If the state allows it, they must have done the research to find out it's all right. So Oregon is a perfect example. Oregon now can have a double mastectomy at 15 without parental consent, but you can't go and use a suntan bed unless you're 18. You get a parent's permission and a doctor's permission. So the state has decided, the risk of long-term cancer risk from getting radiation is much more dangerous than doing surgery and amputating body parts at a younger age for gender. And there are some parents who say, well, the state must be looking out for my best interest. And I always say, oh no, please don't make that mistake.
Yeah.
Very scary.
Evident. And then while it might be only one of the driving forces behind the rapid spread of gender ideology, I'm going to talk a little bit about the money behind gender affirming care. And Jennifer Billick has been following this and writing about this for a while. But what are you seeing about where, who's making money off of? I mean, we know pharma's making money off of puberty blockers, and the hospitals are making money off of the surgeries. But what are you seeing in terms of who's truly making money off of this, and how big a factor do you think money is in this?
Well, yeah, I think Jennifer Bilek has done some great work on this. She's sort of ahead of everybody else in terms of keeping a spotlight on the money. And I think there is a continuing story to do as an investigative reporter. We've always had a motto, follow the money. It's pretty hard to go wrong if you follow the money. I do not think that is the motivation of some of the medical practitioners in that at UCSF, for instance, filled with real activist practitioners, ideologues. I wrote recently in the New York Post about the young psychiatrist, a resident who has put out a textbook, for the Psychiatric Association about what he believes is the case. And it's a textbook. These are real ideologues who have bought it hook, line, and sinker. They've drunk the Kool-Aid. They're not concerned necessarily about the money aspect. There is money being made by the drug companies and by doctors, but
plastic surgeons.
It's a booming. But it is a small amount of money compared. When I say small amount, it's still billions, but it's small compared, let's say, to diabetes drugs or to drugs for heart disease or for drugs for pain. The thing is, some of the money that's being used, and this is where I think it's most nefarious, is money's being held out for donations to prestigious schools in order for them to open up divisions of behavioral health at children's hospitals for gender nonconforming children. So, the Pritzker School of Medicine at the University of Chicago got a $20 million grant. It was the first in the nation, I guess, to do a complete series of gender affirming courses. And, University of Toronto got $20 million, and nobody's pocketing that money and going on vacation. But what does it do? It creates a Center for Sexual Diversity Studies. UCSF essentially got its entire children's psychiatric unit that specializes in LGBT care and gender, funded by gifts from a group of billionaire activists. And so that as that becomes more and more widespread, that is going to affect, I think, the next generation of people who are training to be doctors, and the next generation of people, psychiatrists and professors and teachers. And that is where we're not able to effectively fight it right now.
When we went to the hospital, for me, she told us there's a new department that's being open for that.
Yeah, Trisha, who had breast cancer 3 years ago.
3 years ago, I had breast cancer.
And there's an entire different division for the 1% of breast cancer cases are men, and Trish knows that because she was told her prognosis for chest cancer was good. She went, what? But there's an entire division at University of Miami for those men who have breast cancer and then identify as women, and there are resources being put to that.
Yeah, a lot of money.
And so it's normalizing it within what I call the mainstream structure of schools, universities, and medical schools, and places like Do No Harm are raising a ruckus and trying to point that out, but they seem to be small voices against this tide of money.
Yeah. I read something the other day about some what the U.S. government has put into research on mediating health effects and in mediating social problems. I mean, billions. And then even, the health departments, the state health departments, in terms of grants that they're giving to small organizations, community organizations. I mean, again, millions of dollars going to these organizations to prop this up because, there's a lot of, we know that people who are adopting a gender identity, there's just a big tie-in with other serious mental health issues of depression and anxiety. And so, there's social support that is needed by people, but this is kind of a new avenue to provide that funding but it's specific, as opposed to saying we're going to support people with, crippling anxiety or depression. We're going to put more resources into developing social structures and support. It's sectioned off. You have to be focused on trans-identified people.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think that's so interesting because of the fact that it depends in part on the administration that we have at the time. So we have here, Admiral Rachel Levine, the first transgender, 3 or 4-star admiral, who's the Undersecretary of Health, who is a member of WPATH, the World Professional Association, and is an advocate for this, looking at things through this transgender sort of filter all the time, and that's even made it so that in cases of children who are autistic, there's a study being done in which many of the symptoms of children who are going to talk therapy or cognitive therapy to sort of treat and be their own situations with Asperger or are having symptoms interpreted as relating to trans and identity and helping to sort of push the pipeline forward. So it is a real problem. And we stand, I don't say we stand alone because there are still some other Western countries that are different, but the idea that this is the case here, we know, we recently went through a situation in which emails came out, and we now know that Admiral Levine had been the one who was sort of encouraging WPATH to on its last standards of care that came out a couple of years ago to get rid of age limits. So you wouldn't have to have 15 or 16-year-olds. There'd be no age limits at all. And not only that, but then the White House responds, and many of the listeners may know this, just a week ago or a week and a half ago, show you the dysfunction here, how these things sometimes takes place. The White House responded and said and issued a statement. The White House is not in favor of surgical intervention for minors, something to that effect, paraphrasing. And then they took that back because they must have gotten pushback from some of the progressive end of the party. And they took that back and said, no, we don't mean that as an absolute policy. So it's playing out in real time in front of us. But the confusion when it comes to dealing with medical policies for children, boy, it's critical that we get it right, and we're not doing that.
Yeah, I just want to say, I know somebody requested, I think, to be a speaker. We're going to take questions. We will leave time for questions. So just hold off. We'll get there. Yeah. So the other question is about the pharmaceutical companies and the idea of the off-label route that these that these drugs are kind of funneled through. There's the pharmaceutical companies have no interest in doing any testing to make to expand the use of puberty blockers for the current use for gender. They were used for precocious puberty and other types of problems, prostate cancer, but that's a very peculiar aspect of this. And are there any legal avenues to limiting these practice, or is this just the way it's going to go with this and future drugs, that they'll move them through the off-label route and we won't have any controls?
Yeah, look at off-label. This is like one of the biggest holes in terms of drug dispensing in the United States, is that doctors are presumed by the FDA to have the power to take a drug that's approved for one condition, whether it's diabetes, heart condition, whatever else, and dispense it to a patient for something for which it's never been clinically tested nor approved. And you would think it's a total circumvention of the safety regulations of the FDA. That, by the way, became an FDA policy in the late 1930s, where there were only less than 150 drugs on the market total, not the thousands we have now. It was a much simpler world in terms of medicine, but that has stayed the way it is. And pharma companies like it because when a drug catches on for having another use and it becomes popularized for that, the drug company does not have to go ahead and get it approved before the FDA. They don't have to go through the $1 billion of early research and everything else. And sometimes, it was a high blood pressure medication that turned out to be Viagra. It was another high blood pressure medication that turned out to grow hair and became Rogaine. A medication that was an orphan drug, sort of, this small little drug for a small group genetically affected with this throat problem where they had trouble talking. Botox was found to soften wrinkles and then was dispensed off label for billions of dollars for that. Eventually, the companies, when the drugs become so successful, they will go ahead and they will then get FDA approval, but they've used the population as a human testing clinical trial.
One of the drugs that they use for the children it's a black box.
Yeah, it's a black box. I mean,
which is really like the hype. That is it. It's dangerous.
Yeah, Lupron, which is used off-label as a puberty blocker, the most successful. There are several in that category, but the one that's used off-label for dispensing it for blocking puberty has a black box warning, and it's being given to children without a concern about that. And when I hear people say, and I even hear medical professionals say, by the way, puberty blockers, totally reversible. I just want to scream because it's just absolutely not the case. And there are 10,000 adverse effect reports, at the FDA about women who were given Lupron off-label as children to help them grow taller. And they report, brittle bones, thinning bones, teeth that shed enamel, degenerative spinal disc, painful joints, you name it, seizures, migraines, suicidal ideation. So, but we're giving it to children off-label, which means you don't have to worry about getting it approved. It's just astonishing. By the way, the fact that Trisha kept coming back to, and when we were doing the research for the book Pharma, was the astonishing figures. About half, or a little bit over half, of all the drugs dispensed every year in the United States are dispensed off-label. That is just remarkable. And how it's a giant loophole that has been allowed. To me, it's like one of the things that I would want Republicans and Democrats in Congress to address and pass a bill against to force the FDA to stop it. But you're not going to get it done.
Yeah, I can see that.
So maybe let's switch gears just a little bit. Trisha, I was thinking about your work against anti-Jewish sentiment and how it sort of relates to gender ideology, and that both the left and the right sort of have different versions of anti-Semitism, and the left and the right have different versions of misogyny. Can you comment a little bit on that? And then I have a second question too.
The anti-Semitism is something I know well because I grew up with it in London, and I came from what you would call a modern Orthodox Jewish family, all immigrants, and I refused to go to an all Jewish school and went to a mixed school, and I paid the price. I was a strong girl. My grandfather taught me how to box. Because of this actual problem. And my head was put down the toilet. I was called a dirty Jew. I never could understand, because when you're young, you do not understand why they're calling me dirty Jew, why they say Jews have big noses, big feet, etc., etc. But England, and particularly London, swastikas in your graveyards, and it was just horrendous. Segregating living, where you can live. It's all it. When I see what's going on now, for me personally, it's almost like the 1930s, because it appears to be that everybody, and it's worldwide, make no mistake about this, whether it's Spain or Italy or France, it's worldwide. there are no consequences. If any of this stuff was being done other than Jews, and it was, trans or black or brown or whatever, there would be outrage and people would be screaming. But this is just acceptable. There's a chap that did Bedell that wrote a book, and it was called Jews Don't Count, and he explains it so well. So when I started my anti-Semitism watch, it was, oh my God, 10 years ago. And we noticed it in the universities. But it wasn't really being noticed, a bit like the gender thing. It wasn't really being noticed. And everybody thought that I was overreacting or being hysterical about it. And then when this whole thing happened after October the 7th, people were coming out and saying, oh, you were right. A lot of my Jewish friends here had never suffered anti-Semitism. So they were not really, it wasn't part of their life. And now they're really, really, really uncomfortable, and they're very confused by it. But, there's not much that we don't get blamed for, up to Gerald's book, Case Closed. It's the Jews that killed Kennedy. But
I think that, Trish found it in doing that. And I had a Jewish father, but I was raised Catholic. So, here we are at like this meeting ground. And the two, I share her passion on anti-Semitism. And she would say what happened is that a generation of professors were sort of trained at many of the elite schools who talked about everything in an oppressor-victim narrative, colonialism and imperialism. And, that's our concern sometimes about gender, is that we're getting a group of, coming professors and teachers in medical school that are talking about gender in the politically correct way, so that anti-Semites on the far right, the neo-Nazis, and on the far left, the Islamists, they're united by dislike and hatred of Jews. Whereas on gender, the far left progressives who say we have to start transitioning children if they feel like it at 8, versus the far right that says, by the way, nothing at all, you'll never be able to take a hormone at any time. They both say they're protecting children, but they aren't obviously both protecting children. It's canard. And I think that's what they get away with, is saying, it's just like anti-Semites can say, we're just anti-Zionists.
But
and
that's
yes, you scratch a little under the surface, not usually true. And if you find somebody who's a gender advocate and they say, I'm protecting children, you'll find out, no, they're not protecting children as much as you think. They're actually putting children in harm's way.
To tell you how bad it is in England, I have a cousin, they're all up in age, and they have children, they have grandchildren. And she said to me the other day, I am so happy, because she married a Scotsman, I am so happy that my last name, my maiden name, Goldman, is not Goldman, because I would be so worried for my children, and that my last name is Ness now. I mean, this is 2020. I mean, it's just repulsive to hear something like that.
Yeah, no, I mean,
it's just...
But it goes back, Trish, to what you were talking about before, when you say people are afraid in many instances to speak up about gender because they stay away from, and I know this, if we post something on Twitter or post something on Substack about gender, I will get DMs or an email from somebody that says, by the way, really good piece, I agree with this or that, I just don't want to go public because, and we've talked about this, the very fact that so many people who get pushback. If you're a parent, you're worried about getting pushback on your children. If you are at work, you're worried about getting pushback at work.
We don't have it here, but in England we have a great advocate for this, and that's J.K. Rowling. She has been magnificent with this. She has really fought along with a lot of people. But we don't seem to have that here.
We don't have a single voice.
We don't have a single
We have a lot
voice.
of people. I mean, there are a lot of people doing great work. There are people that I like, Kara Dansky with The Reckoning, and Jennifer Bilek, and Leo Sapor, Ben Ryan. There are a lot of journalists doing good things. There's no sort of what I call voice that's rallying everybody around them. And that's
she really is.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a short little one there.
Yeah, the U.S. needs our own J.K. Rowling, don't we? So thinking about, I'm also Jewish. I use the word evil for the Holocaust. It seems the right word. And I don't like it when people, call someone a Nazi when they're being rigid or dictatorial or something. But
I agree.
I do see that there's something, and you wrote about this in your book, The Pharmacist of Auschwitz, Victor Capesius, the separation of families to me is like the core
Yes.
of evil, is to separate children and parents. And
Yes.
and so in the gender movement, right, there's mass medical experimentation on gay, lesbian, autistic children.
Yes.
And then this ideology is really pushing a wedge between children and families, and almost the schools becoming the parent instead of the parent being the parent. Yeah.
Yeah, I find it interesting, as I was saying to Gerald about exactly what you're talking about. And I was saying, if a child is at school and he or she has a headache or a cold, the parent is called right away. Well, this is like the most important thing. And I find it very confusing. I do not understand how they have the power to do that. I don't know how did we get here? How did we, not you and me, but how did we let this happen? Why are we not screaming on the streets?
Well, that is a great question.
Parents' rights.
And that is exactly why I think the gender ideology movement, the gender industry, has made parents the enemy. So
Absolutely.
that parents who stand against a transition of their child or the possibility of embracing a different gender, they have become the enemy. And once you do that, you're exactly right. You are breaking up the family.
Orwellian comes into it. How do they know what the parents are going to think?
Yeah.
I have a brother who came out to my mother when he was gay, and my mother was like, "That's okay, darling. Just take care of yourself." He's this little Orthodox Jewish. We were in shock. You don't know how someone's going to respond. You can't say the parents are going to respond until you give them a chance.
Yeah.
It's a journey that it's hard. We're not parents, but we have godchildren. And being a parent is probably one of the hardest jobs in the world. You do not go to school for it. You're learning on the job. And so to take your rights away, I find just appalling. Personally.
And I think a lot of what you were asking about before, Eliza and Ellie, is wrapped up in like one thing that's taking place in California now. When you talk about language, how it's being used against it, and where this is moving, there's a bill sitting on Governor Newsom's desk that, if he signs it, will be legislation passed by the state legislature that really will, make sure that schools, teachers, therapists do not notify parents if their child changes their name or pronouns or requests to use facilities or participate in programs that don't match their gender on official school records. Now, it was fascinating to watch the advocates for that in the debate in California say that this policy was needed because of the attacks on transgender children.
Oh my God.
And that transgender children often felt they weren't safe to express themselves at home. So what it was is they said, we're passing legislation to stop forced outing. So you can't out children if they don't want to be outed. Now, the question is, it's sitting on Governor Newsom's desk, who clearly has some sort of ambition one day to sit in the White House, whether it's this time or 4 years from now. Does he actually veto that bill? Because he hasn't indicated what he'll do, because he thinks that's more to the middle, or will he embrace it and California will go one step further out as sort of the edge to follow in terms of progressive politics?
Bonkers. It's not normal.
Yeah, that's Senate Bill 1955. We have to give a shout out to our friend Aaron Friday, who is tirelessly leading the state to a place that where our children are protected. So, and to me, that bill, like a lot of this is completely incoherent, because first to say that the child who everybody at school knows, right? All their friends know, the teachers know, the administration knows, everybody knows, but the parents, that is not outing. And with no evidence that the parents are abusive or there's a concern, this idea that they don't feel safe, that is such an adolescent activist line.
It's an excuse to take control of your children.
And it was and it was heatedly debated. I mean, yes, it passed in the legislature, but it was heatedly debated, and it was held up for a day. Sort of watch this. We watch and follow things in detail that we don't always write about because we don't have the time to write about it. But we've been following this and may write about it at some point. But the fact that, and the governor was asked, Newsom was asked, you're going to sign it or not? And he said, I don't comment in advance as to whether I'm signing bills. That's absolutely false. Any number of times he has said, if that bill lands on my desk, I'm going to veto it, or that he has said, so this he hasn't staked out a position, and I'm not sure where he ends up coming down. But this is what
they're saying. This is to take control of the children. Is to break up to take away trusting your mom and your dad, or if you have two mothers or two fathers, is to take away the trust of the parents.
It really, the state becomes the guardian for the child as opposed to the parents being the guardian for the child's health or well-being.
Well, the only way you can, this is happening in England as well. And Barbara, my cousin, was telling me they're just taking their kids out of school and they're doing home tutoring with parents are getting together. An option no, I know it's not always, but these are parents getting together as groups.
Yeah.
And taking it on as a group.
Right.
We have a woman in this building it's happened to.
Yeah.
Yeah. The thing that I find so kind of crazy making about those bills like this is that, if you say that these kids need these medical interventions because it is life-saving care, because they're going to, they're going to self-harm if they don't get this medication, but the parents shouldn't be told that their child is now have entered a cohort that is susceptible, to bullying or what have you, that would cause this self-harm. So how is that coherent at all? And what is their plan for raising the child during the summer? It's like, we're going to protect you all year long, but we'll see you in the fall. Good luck over the summer.
No.
Your parents.
It's so true. And it's very interesting because there's a state superintendent of public instruction there, Tony Thurmond, who has announced plans to run for governor in 2026. He stood alongside the members of the California Legislative LGBTQ caucus in support of the bill. And the line that he used, and I don't have it in front of me, but I'm pretty sure I have a sticky memory. This is pretty close to being exactly on. And I thought this is the perversion of language. He said, this is a matter of safety. This is a matter of privacy. Now, if you don't know what it really means, you view that as somebody who doesn't have, you're not a parent, you're somebody else, you're concerned about inflation, you're worried about what's happening with the border, you're worried about green energy or whatever else, and this comes up as an issue in the newspaper or online or whatever else, and you hear about something in California that's being passed as a matter of safety and privacy for children, your knee-jerk response, if you're a liberal, is to say that has to be a good thing. So, you've got to get into the details a little bit to realize how crazy that is.
Let me use a very American expression. What is the end game? What is this all about? That's what we should be. What is it all about?
You ask me that often. I don't have an answer for you.
What is this? Is it to sexualize the children? What is the answer here?
There are a lot of different motivations. That's what we were talking about before. Sometimes money, sometimes ideology, sometimes, early sexualization of children. There's a whole bunch of different reasons why people get into the camp of pushing the idea that children can and should change their gender.
Yeah. Strange. So we want to get back to this question of covering this topic, as journalists, but I do have two questions that I just want quick answers to, so we can move on because I have to ask them. And the first is, I play this game called Stupid or Evil. And I look at the people who are promoting this and I try and figure out, which side is it for these people? Maybe it's not that simplistic because we know that there's nuance there, but, do you believe that people get it? Because Kara, if you read The Reckoning, there's quite a bit of evidence that, Kara Dansky's The Reckoning, that certainly our representatives do know what's happening. But people like Jon Stewart or John Oliver, do they get this, or do they really not get this?
I think they get it, but I think they're also in their own, as outspoken as they are, I think they're too scared to speak out. ratings, audience. I think you said evil or stupid. I think a lot of them are evil. I really do. I say that to Gerald. I'm not going to mention any names, but he knows exactly what I'm talking about. It's demonic to me.
Yes, I mean, you're right. It's simplistic, like split evil or is stupid. But I think it's a bit of both.
Yeah.
And I think and I don't know. I've been on Jon Stewart a couple of times. I like him, but I haven't been on in years since he came back. And Stewart is somebody who, thinks that he's figured it out. And I would tend to think that I'd love to have a discussion with him, not on television, just over a long lunch or coffee and lay it out, because I can't believe that the Jon Stewart that I sort of understood, even though he's progressive and liberal and embraces all those things, a light bulb wouldn't go off in his head and he would say, hold on a second, I drank the Kool-Aid here, I don't need to. So I don't think, right.
As well.
And so I just, that's the thing. But there's no doubt that on others, Scott Wiener, the state senator in California, has been at the forefront of a lot of this. They're just nefarious for a whole bunch of reasons.
Okay, my second question, which is only my question because Eliza has no interest and doesn't want to know about this, but when I was reading one of your pieces, you mentioned current research on womb transplants, and I have to ask about that. Is this something that we're really going to be seeing in the coming decade? Males giving birth, which to me seems highly unlikely, and will no doubt result in some pretty horrific post-surgery outcomes.
People don't. I mean, they don't have the body makeup.
They don't have the rest of the plumbing. It takes more than just bringing over. Right. People think it's
really sick.
But the idea of the womb transplants, by the way, and this one womb transplant that was done on an experimental basis from somebody who had passed away, so cadaver womb was woman to woman, biological woman to biological woman, trying to get a functioning womb into a woman that needed a healthy woman, but believe it or not, so that was different, and that could be opening up. So they're biological woman to biological woman, but the idea that somebody who is a man and now has had cosmetic surgery to look like a woman and is taking estrogen is going to get a womb transplant and have a child. If any doctor convinces them of that, I think even that doctor would be stripped of his medical license in 36 seconds.
I don't know anymore. I would agree with you 10 years ago, but now
I agree with you. I don't think it would be stripped. I agree with you.
And Ellie, I mean, not to drag this out for Eliza's sake, but the shadow secretary, the former shadow secretary, now the foreign secretary of England, as a matter of fact, you may have seen, was involved in a controversy not about what he felt on foreign affairs, but on the idea that this science was able to actually trans women could have a cervix. He said, he thought that science had gone to the point, and people were saying,
"This is my country."
I mean, we've got to be kidding. So anyway,
I think you all are just trying to give me terrible nightmares. Back to the stupid or evil. I mean, I think, I've heard people say people go crazy in groups and then they regain their sanity one person at a time. So this is what I'm hoping to see. And it's too slow, right? They all went over the cliff together and now they need to come back, but it's one person at a time. So it's very slow.
So I think we're dealing with two things. I think it's contagion and trending. We always have trending things.
Social media makes it
social media makes it a trend.
Yeah.
And then the contagion, I think that happened with anorexia.
Yeah. And that's true. And there was, I've been pleasantly surprised. We both have been about the speed at which it moved the opposite. The pendulum came back towards sanity in places like Finland and Scandinavia and the UK and that. I tend to think that I know quite a few people who write about this all the time, are looking at it and are reporting on it, think that the corner's been turned, that that the Cass report and others have broken the back of gender ideology. And I just don't, maybe I'm just more of a pessimist on this. I don't think so. I see how many schools and special gender clinics and things like that are being formed at major universities for multi-million-dollar grants. I understand that it's not going away tomorrow, and that although there have been some real victories toward common sense, there's still a long way to go.
Yes.
left the room.
I agree. This has its tentacles into every part of society, so it's going to be a long walk back. So I'm curious, what's been your experience of trying to discuss this issue, both in your social and professional circles, and uh, should our focus be? I guess we're trying to figure this out too. Do we need to convince people who are enamored with this ideology to let it go? Or is it really more about to help people who kind of already understand to find the courage to speak up?
Well, it's really interesting because we find a lot of our gay male friends are just perplexed by it. Don't you think so, Gerald?
Yeah, many times.
Many times they are. They're just not, they
the
feel like
transing of gay rights.
It's like the transing of gay rights, that they've fought so hard for everything they have now, and they feel the people are looking at them differently, seeing a whole, it's really uncomfortable. As for the other side, there are not many people, maybe a handful of people that we talk to that really understand the common sense part of it.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. I mean, I think you have to go after both. I mean, in the sense that if I'm writing a piece, if Trisha's writing a piece, if we're talking somewhere, we're thinking that we may not be talking to the real hardcore advocates who, because they just aren't listening to us. But if they were, I'd love to have that discussion with them to sort of put a little bit of questions and doubts into it, because there is so much evidence. I mean, I'm not just saying this as an opinion. It's just a matter of not just common sense, but just the facts and the evidence. And you can go back through the history of this and you can discuss it. And if you do, you can sometimes take out some of the fervor of people who are real strong advocates at the same time that you give courage to the average person to sort of speak their mind a little bit without being labeled as bigots and transphobes. I get it.
Right.
People don't like to be called names. I mean, we don't like it when we're called names. But, we've gotten to the point where, it's sort of like it becomes part of what you do and you ignore it and you go on and you keep doing it.
Right. I think part of what our hope is with DIAG is that we provide a little cover so that it's not a single voice, but, people can find each other who share these views and then hopefully, feel a little less intimidated to speak out.
I think
Go
that's
ahead.
one of the things that DIAG, when we were introduced to you, we thought, wow, what a great idea for a group, because it's not just that you're saying we want to bring this issue to parents, and that you're saying we want to do it inside the Democratic Party, which is the party. If you have to look at a party, we're overgeneralizing where it's more embraced than anywhere else, and so as a result, it could really have a major change. And there are these nonpartisan groups I discovered only today. Restore Childhood, this sort of nonpartisan approach to gender, trying to give parents some tools to be able to work their way through this when a conversation comes up. So I love the idea that instead of getting into our corners, on left and right, and it becomes an issue that, we're shouting about one way or the other, that it becomes the source of what I call just more mainstream conversation by people who say, you know what, I may not agree with you on all these issues across the board on everything from, Ukraine to the Middle East to the border to inflation, but I do agree with you what's happening on gender, and let's talk about that.
Mm-hmm. That Restore Childhood gender toolkit, if people are not aware of that, it's very comprehensive and it's some very good tools for parents to take to their schools, and so I encourage people to check that out. So let's talk a little bit about just being a journalist in this climate. I'm sure you've both bumped into barriers, as you mentioned before, trying to report on this issue. Do you sort of have a assessment of the state of free speech in woke America, and what do you hear from other journalists about the difficulty of trying to write on this topic?
We definitely hear about
we definitely free speech, journalism, movie making, TV making. There's too many boxes to tick now. The publishers are scared. There are so many people that are just not comfortable that's why eventually everything will become so boring,
Yeah.
because it's just the one think, one speak way.
And you know, for us, okay, so we're old school, and even though we write about topics that we can, I used to be proud of the fact that I came out with a book on the finances of the Vatican or pharma.
Right.
I could appear on CNN and Fox.
Yeah.
Wow, those are the old-fashioned days, right? You could be on both different channels for that. On MSNBC, I used to be on Keith Olbermann, and then I did Bill O'Reilly on the same book. My God, that could never happen today.
And then you used to do Crossfire.
And that's right.
Where you would debate.
That's right. So now they put you in a category. And when the reason I say that is I did 3 op-eds in the last couple of years for the New York Times, which still is the gray lady. It's still, I know a lot of people can't stand the Times and that. There's plenty in the Times that gets me crazy, including the op-ed that was run today about gender by Jack Turturro. It's a terrible piece. But I did these 3 op-eds, 2 with bankruptcy professors about the opioid trade. So I had editors there that I knew. And I went back to the Times first with a piece about puberty blockers, because the idea was, based upon what had been done in pharma, it really was a story about drugs that were being dispensed that weren't approved and what the danger was. They passed before I went to the Wall Street Journal. So the Wall Street Journal printed it. Trisha, when she printed her piece on when did women become a dirty word, sent it in blind to an editor she never met, and they liked it and ran it, which is like hitting the lottery, because you know that doesn't happen often. The last 2 pieces I published about the American Psychiatric Association and the WPATH files, the Wall Street Journal passed on, and they ended up in the New York Post. Now, that's not to say, I don't mean to say to, if the New York Post editor is on here, your second choice, you weren't.
Right,
but
right.
So what happens is now, if you're the Times or the Atlantic or something else, you look at my recent work on gender and you say, oh, those people are published by the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post. They must be right wingers, and that's the problem getting boxed in. But it's the nature of getting published.
I mean, just to give you a little taste of the Capizis book, Pharmacists of Auschwitz, that I did, when I tried to sell it in America, a very, very high-profile person in a very high-profile publishing house said to me, oh no, the Holocaust is not trending.
I did love that.
And you have to, that's really...
He was Jewish, but that's still...
So publishing has always been antiquated. We've been doing this since the 80s, but it's even worse now. And I hate to use this word, please forgive me, but it has become woke. It's become... you cannot move out of these boxes that they put you in.
And I will just say
I don't think Gerald could have written quite a few of his books in this day, in this environment.
Maybe. I mean, I'm not sure, but, years ago I did a book on the Martin Luther King assassination. I was very critical of the King family because they had come to believe that James Earl Ray was innocent. I criticized them regularly for having been duped into this conspiracy. Nobody ever said, by the way, it was published in 1998, that as a white author, I was being disrespectful and racist to the first family of civil rights, the King family.
Or it should have been written by a black person.
That's right.
No one
today,
ever said
maybe that would become an issue.
Today it'd be different. When he did his book on Motown, I think it's the same.
Okay. So I think that, we as journalists write what we want to write, but we know that the market for getting it published outside of self-publishing a book or doing a Substack or whatever, we put as much effort into that, but it reaches a much smaller market. You'd like to get it out in what I call the legacy newspapers, the Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post. You want to get it covered on CBS or wherever else. That's increasingly difficult.
Very difficult.
If you have what I call a gender critical view,
or if you have something that they don't feel fits into their box. It's I think Abigail Schreier was very lucky. She got onto a lot of different formats.
And you will note, I think, that, for instance, it was a psychiatrist, who had turned me on to the fact that the Psychiatric Association had a textbook out that was a Bible for gender affirming care, quote unquote, and it was just a terrible book. And this was going to train the psychiatric students. She said, they are ignoring us. We have a petition that we signed with tens of thousands and tens of thousands of signatures from medical professionals and others asking them to withdraw that book, and there's a precedent for it. They just ignore us. I got that published in the New York Post. It got a lot of play, and they still ignored it. They still go ahead and they just ignore the press Nobody's holding their feet to the fire, and part of that is a failure of journalism, a failure of mainstream journalists who cover these subjects in science and health for the main newspapers and magazines not to pick up on these issues because they are concerned about doing it.
Well, yeah, and it's certainly, it's one thing to say we're not going to publish your book because it's not quote unquote trending, but it's another thing when your topic is considered, heresy.
Yes,
right,
correct.
Yeah.
Nobody will say that though to you. So what you get is no editor will come back and say, "How dare you criticize puberty blockers or that?" They'll just say, "And look at." I get this. We say this all the time. We propose op-eds to LA Times, Chicago Tribune. Op-eds take a lot of work for a small amount of thing, but you get a big megaphone. We propose op-eds on different subjects, and we often get a no, or we don't even hear back from the editor. That's their way of saying no. They don't even get back to you. But so it could be rejected for a whole bunch of reasons, but you can see what else is being run there, and there just isn't gender critical material.
But it is sad what you just said about how you could be on MSNBC, CBS, CNN, Fox. Now, once I know when Gerald did a couple of shows on Fox, people would say to him, "Are you really going to do that? Oh my God, how can you go on there?" It's like,
that's become part of the polarization, and so that's unfortunate because
that's really bad.
You're talking about an issue like gender. If you are not talking to very conservative Republicans and very liberal Democrats, you're doing a disservice to the subject.
Really bad.
Well, we have a couple more questions for you, and then we want to move to our listener questions. What are your views about the responsibility of everyday citizens sort of allowing this? We talked a little bit about journalists, but just everyday American citizens allowing this medical and ideological scandal to continue uncontested. And what do you think when people truly believe they're doing good? What do you think our best avenues to shake loose their beliefs are?
I'm going to let Gerald take that part, but I think the first part really is that most people, because we have so much knowledge and we know so much, we assume that they're ignorant to it. They don't know enough. They don't read enough to know. And if you look at mainstream media, they really do not talk about it. And I think the other one, a real simple one here, is people are scared to speak out. Mm-hmm. They're scared. They're really scared. What will my neighbor think? What will my family think? Will I lose my job? There's so many variables now which you would never have dreamed possible years ago. Will I lose my livelihood to feed my family?
And I don't think that. I don't put the onus on the average person. The people, should speak up. Yes, it would be great to think if they would or could, but it's really going to have to be by what I view as journalists and parents and those who are on fire on this. DIAG and other groups and Do No Harm and, reporters like Karadansky and others, that continuing to put a spotlight on it. Just because when it eventually does crack, and, there are some cracks around the edges, but when it really breaks, as it did, and you may think this is a crazy analogy,
I have no idea what he's going to say. What is it?
No, as it broke with lobotomies, in the 50s, when everybody embraced it and won a Nobel Prize. One of the doctors who invented won a Nobel. So there was a time when people really thought this was a big advance in neurological surgery. When that broke and became one of the biggest medical scandals, we will hopefully, Trisha and I will live long enough to see this in our rearview mirror as one of the great medical scandals of our time. But in the meantime, children suffer.
But the problem is, if we don't get a hold of it sooner than later, there are going to be so many children mutilated and damaged mentally and physically.
Yeah.
And that just breaks my heart. Absolutely. Because I don't know how anyone can have a conscience and allow this to happen.
And so I guess that goes back to your question about what do you do with the real, true ideologues that people believe in it fervently. I've had some discussions with people, and I think that it's very, very hard to make any you just end up going in a circle. It becomes increasingly difficult, and I know that
I will say,
Jennifer Poyer Ackerman, who is on and is on and one of the volunteers with DIAG, we were trading emails recently about a person that we just were running in circles with, because you just try to make a point and it's very difficult to have it land, because they view it almost as, I said this once about the Kennedy assassination, Jenny reminded me, it's like a religion. It becomes almost like a religious belief, so facts don't dissuade you.
What a lot of people have not thought about, I happen to have a few friends that happen to be trans, but they're in their 60s, they're 68, 69. They're horrified by all this. They just want to live their life. They feel like they've been made into freaks.
And they are horrified sort of at the minors and the questions of
what's
under
going
18
on?
and
They
things
think
like
it's
this.
terrible.
So
we don't even think about those people that are trying to live their lives. The whole thing is just very sad and very scary.
Yeah. Okay. Ellie, do you want to go ahead and move to some questions?
Yeah.
Listeners?
I think we should do that. Let's open it up. If as usual, we're a little tight on time. We always, want to leave questions.
We give long answers. We give long answers. Sorry.
Well, and there's a lot to cover. I think we're holding back some questions to allow people to ask their own, but we could, I could talk about this all day. The Posners have obviously contributed on a wide range of fronts, but as much as you'd like to offer that one piece of evidence that the JFK assassination was an inside job, please stick to the topic at hand. Also, please be brief. Use your time to ask a question. If you have a statement to make, please use the chat instead. We'd like to give as many people as possible a chance to ask a question, so that might mean that we need to cut you off, and know that we will definitely cut you off if you're not civil. Also, and this is important, we have encountered problems trying to shift listeners who would like to ask questions to into the speaker role. And that happens often if they're not on an iPhone. So if you're having trouble getting elevated to speaker, or it seems to kind of bounce back and forth, or you can't accept it, or it seems like we're not hearing you and not able to ask, to enable you to ask your question, know that we are trying to do that, and go ahead and post them, and we'll check the message thread as well.
And by the way, to the listeners out there, to Liza and Ellie, thank you very much, because this is the first time Trisha and me have done
We've never done this
X-Space.
before.
So we're virgins to this, and you have made it so simple. Now we actually like it. We're going to have to do others, but
Thank
no, we
you.
like it.
Yeah, it's great fun. Thank you for joining us. Does anyone want to join to have a question? Because if you don't, I'm going to go back to asking about Bloomberg. Okay, we'll wait until somebody has a question. One question that somebody asked before was whether or not you see, is this on its way down? Are we, do you think this is turning? And, if not, what do you think it's going to take to turn this?
I don't know.
We don't have an easy answer. I wish we did, to say,
I think people need to come out.
Yeah,
Parents need to come out. They need to feel as passionate as they do about women's rights with abortion, and they need to come out and say, not with my child. That's what they need. They need to march.
I do think it can be a parents' movement in many ways. The parents can be the activists on this. We will march with you. But no, and what I do think that sometimes something happens that you don't expect. So, for instance, in England, they had this long discussion after Tavistock, their only gender youth clinic, was closed up. And, Hannah Barnes did a great book called Time to Think about what happened with that. But that didn't stop puberty blockers from being dispensed there, even though the only gender clinic had been, it took Hillary Cass, this pediatrician who was assigned by the government to look into it and put out a 399-page report that was definitive in highlighting the dangers, that then turned the tide. And suddenly the government and the NHS said, oh, okay, now we understand it. And they used that report to be able to stop the dispensing of puberty blockers. So if we had thought 2 or 3 years ago it would take a report by a pediatrician that would be a thorough report, we would have asked for it then. So you don't know necessarily what will be the big movie.
Do you have no shame?
Yeah, that's right. Trisha pointed out, like during Joe McCarthy's period, there was the question posed, have you no shame, sir?
So
and
you
sort of turn the moment. You don't know.
You don't know what that turning point is.
Okay, we're going to allow some of our listeners to ask questions. We're going to start with Brandon Showalter, then we'll go to illegal immigrant, officer Eric Blair, something that I can't see. Oh boy, we've got a lot. So we'll take those three and then we'll keep going.
Okay. Sorry, sirens are in the background.
Okay, hi, I'm ready to go.
Hi.
Go right ahead. Yep.
Yes. Thank you so much to the Posners. It's great to hear from you, and I want to make sure that I draw your attention that Kara Dansky is trying to speak request as well. For whatever reason, I'm seeing her comments in the chat, but I wanted to give her a shout out because my question is, as she argues this in The Reckoning, that the people most responsible for this scandal, along with the schools, is the media. Do the Posners have any kind of insight on what it might take to crack through that particular blockade?
I'll let Joe take the question.
I don't, Brendan. And, if I did, I'd already have a book signed or something on this. And I don't know what it will take because I know that organizations and big outlets and big media groups are worried about the reaction, not just of trans activists. They're worried about the reaction of employees far down the scale inside the company and what the pushback will be. So, I mean, if you happen to remember on unrelated to trans, but the director, the editor of the op-ed page, the editorial page for the New York Times had to resign after George Floyd when he allowed, Senator Cotton to run an op-ed that said maybe the military should be called in. And even though the Times apologized for it, the reaction from employees, often at very low levels, was so vociferous that the Times ended up dismissing him. So I think that they're sort of they're in this they're cowards. Trisha's right. Excuse me, they're cowards. Thank you, Trisha. I was trying to be diplomatic, but they're cowards, and I don't know what it will take for somebody to finally turn around. There will be some reporter for maybe a mainstream magazine that will eventually win a Pulitzer for doing what we all say. Everyone listening tonight will say, "Oh my God, we knew that 5 years ago." But you know what? It'll be fine. It'll finally be the mainstream way of doing it. But I'm not sure when that's happening. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that answer. I'll just say people are not predisposed to listen to Christian media. I work for the Christian Post, but I am totally willing to talk to everybody. As people can attest, I've had many left-wing, lesbians, anybody and everybody's welcome to talk to us, even if there's disagreement.
We will.
Let me tell you something about Brandon, as a matter of fact, because I see his things on regularly, and some of the best little coverage of what's happening is often inside that publication. And when I tell somebody about it, they'll say, "Oh, well, that's Christian media. No wonder they just, no wonder."
Yeah,
oh my
I
God.
I know.
And so it's so fascinating because that's one of the cases where it gets tarred and feathered. But keep it up, Brandon.
We have our support.
Well, thank you all for your important work. I really appreciate this.
Thank you.
It's so important that this is brought bipartisan, and this is about human lives here. It shouldn't.
Yep.
Absolutely.
So I'm sorry. I know I gave us an order, but we were finally able to get through to Kara. So Kara, why don't you join us with your comments and questions?
Okay, is this working now?
It is. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. First of all, thank you, DIAG, for everything you do and for having this space. Thank you to the Posners. for being here. And thank you especially to Gerald for endorsing my book, The Reckoning. I very much
It is so great. I mean, I loved it. I am wild. The Reckoning is like, so, you know, there are a number of books that we like, and you know, I tell people about Bad Therapy from Abigail Shire, and I tell them about, you know, Jennifer Bielek's new book, but The Reckoning is like a book that, you know, is a holiday gift, and then people get back to us and say, oh my God, that book. So thank you for writing it.
Well, thank you so much for plugging it so I don't have to. So I'd like to make a quick case for why I think there's no way Jon Stewart doesn't know what's going on. Is that okay?
All right,
Yes,
Please.
All right. So Dave Chappelle in October of 2021 came out with The Closer on Netflix, right? So this is October 2021, in which he talks about, you know, men in women's spaces. He mentions J.K. Rowling, and he says he's Team TERF. He doesn't explain what that means. He just says he's Team TERF, and then he kind of let it go with that. Now, Dave Chappelle and Jon Stewart are kind of BFFs, right? I mean, I don't know either of them, but they're very, very close. They spent the entire summer of 2020 together in the town where Chappelle lives in Ohio, making a movie that turned out to be a really wonderful and heartfelt movie about a rural community going through the early days of the pandemic. I don't mean this to be an endorsement of Chappelle or anything. All I'm saying is Jon Stewart and Dave Chappelle are very, very close. And after The Closer came out, Jon Stewart was asked to comment on it. And he said something very sort of lefty dubro-y. I hope people know what I mean by that, and I hope no one's offended by it. But he said something very lefty dubro-y, saying, you know, Dave Chappelle is a really great dude, and I love the guy, and he doesn't mean any harm, or something, right? Like Stewart commented on what Chappelle said in The Closer. The following summer, 2022, Chappelle is introducing Stewart at the Mark Twain Comedy Awards at the Kennedy Center in DC, and gives some very personal anecdotes about their very personal friendship. So here's my case. If Jon Stewart didn't understand the issue of, you know, how so-called gender identity conflicts with women's sex-based rights at a minimum, in October of 2021, he certainly did when Chappelle came out with his quote about Team TERF. And he must, and if he didn't know it then, he would have looked into it. He absolutely would have looked into what his buddy Chappelle was saying and why he said it. And by the summer of 2022, would have known it. And then Jon Stewart's Apple podcast on the topic came out in October of 2022, a year almost to the day of The Closer in Netflix. And Stewart's hour-long podcast didn't have a single word from any of us here or anyone who might represent views that many of us hold. Not one. The only panel he held was, I believe, if memory serves, two parents of kids who call themselves trans. I believe Chase Strangio from the ACLU was on that panel, and someone else who I'm not remembering at the moment. And the only bit in that entire podcast was, I believe, the Attorney General of Arkansas. Brandon can correct me if I'm getting that wrong. But it was a completely manipulative interview that he did of her. So I'm just here to say, I don't think there is any way that Jon Stewart didn't know exactly what he was doing. And I do think, as both Gerald and Trisha have said, I think that there are people who are sincerely manipulated into believing in this stuff. But I think it's a big mistake to think that anyone who is among the political, journalistic, or cultural elite who is genuinely in the dark.
It's a great point.
That at this point.
It's a great point, Karen. As a matter of fact, I remember, because that 2022, you know, Apple podcast or that, I mean, there were things in there that set our hair on fire. I remember, you know, when the Arkansas Attorney General said that, you know, most kids, over 90% with gender dysphoria eventually grow out of it. Stuart said something like that was fake. That's just a false number. It doesn't fit with any of the studies that exist from medical organizations. And he had I remember trying to reach him afterwards. It shows you the depth of our desperation. You only have access as somebody who has gone on to one of those programs in the past through producers.
Sure.
Once the producers are gone, you're finished because, right, we don't have a cell phone or an email or whatever else. And so I tried and failed to be able to send him things that I thought he just must be missing. But you're right. I've given him, out of the fact of that, you've convinced me that he in fact does know and doesn't actually care. He's just become an advocate for it, and it's really a shame because he's smart enough to know better if he looked at it, but he's not going to.
Yeah, that is a shame, and I think eventually, that's going to be part of the legacy of the people that vocally supported this.
I agree completely with you.
Okay, we have a couple other requests. We'll take some questions. Good to hear from you, Kara, and thank you for joining us. So we'll go to legal immigrant. I think that was the next in line. You can now speak. Should be. Yeah, we can hear you.
So, I'm a child psychiatrist and involved in the psychiatric field. And there is a very broad belief among child psychiatrists, very deeply held through many people, is that they really believe that the gender affirming care is the compassionate model, and it's the evidence-based model. And we have had a lot of difficulty even trying to generate a debate, let's put this open for discussion. And so I believe that even among these people who are educators, scientists, clinicians, there's a lot of people who are not, I think, even willing to entertain the debate. They've never been exposed to one. And so within our professional organizations, what do you think is the best way for us to kind of force this debate to happen in the open?
Well, I think that one of the ways for it to happen is to let's say you're dealing with psychiatrists who have embraced gender affirming care as what they view as the compassionate model. So if you ask the question, the last gender dysphoria definition is now 11 years old, right? It's from the 2013 DSM-5. And it changed the requirement for 2 years of living in the want to be gender to 6 months of therapy if somebody was through that period of 6 months, but 6 months no longer holds. So one of the questions I would have for what I call activist psychiatrists is, why are you approving sometimes adolescents to move forward to medicalization like cross-sex hormones or puberty blockers after 2 weeks? There are instances literally of 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, much less 6 months. Why the rush as opposed to talk therapy first? Now, there are problems with therapy if it becomes like the current APA, the American Psychiatric Association textbook. I get that. But the other thing is, for doctors and those who are advocates, if they can agree that there is such a thing as intersex, it used to be called hermaphrodites, there are truly people born and they require possibly hormones and some surgery to fit into a gender that they grow up in. That may be what, 1,000th of 1%? Is sometime 1,000th of, so it's a very small number of people. You can get an agreement often, even with practitioners, that we're overdiagnosing. It's not suddenly that 15 or 20% of classrooms of 16-year-old girls believe they are of the wrong gender, because 20% has always believed that, but they just never had the opportunity to express it. It is a contagion in that sense. And so the real question then becomes, for practitioners who embrace a gender-affirming care model, is if we're overdiagnosing, what are the consequences to that? And if the consequences are drugs that lead permanent ramifications, like with cross-sex hormones, or surgeries that include amputations, there are very serious consequences to overdiagnosing. So I like the overdiagnosis. I say, okay, let's agree for a second there's intersex, and there's a small number of children who really feel trapped in the wrong body. Now, that aside, why are we now having the numbers that we're seeing and embracing it as a much larger societal image? Because we have this easy, fast process to get there. That might give some basis to start to have a discussion on it. You might be speechless because you totally disagree with what I said.
Sorry. No. I'm sorry. I think that, I agree that this is a great thing to lead with, because I feel like if I am too strong about throwing skepticism on the whole thing, it's like, I'm going to be branded, an ideologue. But I think the opening move is to ask this question of what do you think the prevalence is? And with clinicians, sometimes I have to I try to push them outside of the idea that the kid can self-diagnose their gender dysphoria. And just because they report it, that means we need to go with it and hold on to it.
I have a Substack I put out a few months ago, called "Who Put the Kids in Charge?" It goes to that very idea of what you're talking about, which is the idea that once a child has determined that they identify as a different gender and they express that to a professional, a therapist, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, there's no room for you professionally to push back on that in many ways, to say, could it be something else? Could, the fact that you have body dysmorphia, do you feel depressed? Are you going through this? Are you autistic? Is it a symbol of trying to be different? Okay. You have to be very careful. And the figures are still astonishing in terms of how overwhelming they are. The 90, 95%, 98%, depending on the study you look at, when you do not rush the transition, children do often pass through it as a transient phase, with a large number coming out and later being gay, identifying as gay, but not identifying as a different gender that requires surgical modification to fit into their sexual lifestyle for the rest of their lives.
There are just masses of people that are quite convinced on all of this. And I think that, we have to be very careful on how we phrase this and not talk just off the bat in absolute terms, because it will, I think, inflame the situation worse.
Well, so one of the things that's interesting is that the American Psychiatric Association, right, in its first textbook on gender affirming psychiatric care, edited by a young psychiatric resident, the association knows when they chose that editor, who identifies, as I'm quoting from him here, as a non-binary, trans, queer, neurodivergent, chronically ill Jewish person, end quote. That's the bio description. You know what you're getting is the APA if that's the editor of the book, and that's what they got back. So what I don't like is when the medical societies are putting their finger on the scale. You were right when you said we shouldn't come in and be, if we're too dogmatic, we'll turn people off inside the sciences. But the sciences are often already putting their finger on the scale. And when I see that, as a journalist, that's problematic to me as well. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry, I don't hear anybody. I don't know if someone else is talking, and it could be a glitch.
Oh, yeah, no, you're on. Go right ahead.
Okay, thank you. So, very quickly, is there precedent for a medical scandal that involved experimentation on children, and to what level they could consent to that? And then I've encountered, not really interacted with, but encountered about 3 trans kids, and every single time, it's like I almost want to just grab them by the shoulders and just say, your parents are lying to you, the Republicans aren't out to kill you. They're just worried about this experiment they're doing on you. So I was just curious what, if any, what kind of interactions you have had with actual trans kids, or what you would like to say, or how you would go about that, if you could.
Yeah, we have had contact with trans kids, but also with their parents, and in some cases with grandparents. And it is a difficult situation. It's not easy at all. It becomes much more personal, and those discussions are, they're mixed up in the emotion of the family and the child, and people have a way, and this is a great overgeneralization. Trisha and I have talked about this, of justifying to themselves the decisions they've made, right? You can't make a decision and then second guess yourself. So people sort of, come up with the reasons why, whether they think it was suicide or they're happier or I think they're better off or this is better for them. But in a straight factual basis, I don't know if that's always true. And, when you ask the question, are there other situations in which children, there's a case at the turn of the century, like 1910 or 1911, in which a doctor from the Rockefeller Center had been injecting hospital patients with a syphilis extract, believe it or not, and some of those were children. But that wasn't just directed at children. There was an infected blood scandal where a lot of children were used as guinea pigs in clinical trials in Britain, and that was a major. There are experiments by Nazis, as Tricia says, Mengele,
Joseph Mengele.
Racial experiments to see if they could come up and craft a perfect race. And that's one of the things that got me so incensed and immediately got me involved in that case years ago, was that there was children being experimented on. So that what gets us, Tricia's talking about women's rights, Title IX, the erasure of women, and I talking about trans and the gender, but I'm focusing a lot, and so is Trish, on children, on minors, because if you're over 18, even though I think you may be making the wrong choice many times, you get the right to go ahead and do that. And whether taxpayers should be paying for that, that's a different debate. But under 18, it's a completely different thing, and that's what has me so focused in a sense.
Okay, next we're going to go in this order. We'll go to Aaron Friday, Ewan McKenna, and then Learned Mama. So go ahead, Aaron.
But when you said before, is this Ellie or Liza?
This is Ellie.
Ellie, when you mentioned Aaron Friday, and we had heard about her and everything else, but the great thing about doing something like this is we're able to go over and follow her now on Twitter. And so we'll see the legal work that she's doing, and, for our duty, that is very cool. So she's doing some great stuff.
Definitely. Okay, well, try and rejoin us, Aaron. We're going to go to Ewan McKenna. You can speak now. You should be able to. Oh, we've got a... Yep, you're muted as well. If you're not on an iPhone, I will say that can cause problems, but you're muted, Ewan, so...
apologies. Sorry, there's a bit of a... Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Apologies about that. Gerald and Trisha, it's great to talk to you. You've been very kind to me in the past, and I hope you're all keeping well.
Thank you.
I'm coming at this from kind of a more, because obviously you guys get into the minutiae of it all. And I was just thinking about this because I for years I've been writing about kind of the trans issue in sport with women, and their space has been taken away, and these kind of things. But even beyond that, just as a journalist, I've been looking at media over recent years and their coverage of this, and I look at young journalists trying to get into it because as a journalist, I've set up a company to try and help younger journalists, and they all have to kind of respect this doctrine of pronouns, of this, that, and the other, and it's very specific. And if you don't do it, you're not getting a job in the New York Times or the Guardian or whatever else. And I was quite curious about your thoughts on, like, look, we might think mainstream media is going down the hole, but it's still incredibly influential. And when it's promoting these things as almost a doctrine, and 70% of people who don't really care about these things because it doesn't affect them personally, but they just read what they think, and then they kind of promote it and think it, etc., etc. How do we go about it? Because I don't know. Trisha might know, and Gerald, you might know too. But I remember growing up in the 80s and 90s in Ireland, and I kind of wondered how the abuse of children in our country by the Catholic Church in the 60s and 70s was got away with. And I never understood it until now, when I see everyone just following a doctrine. And I'm just sorry. My overarching question is, when media has this idea that to work for them, to get into them, you have to promote this ideal. And most people are just going to read the mainstream media rather than what
Correct.
what independent journalists do. How do we go about solving this?
It's become very hard, don't you think so?
Yeah, I
Sure?
really do think so.
It's in all industries as well.
In terms of information and
Information,
media. And,
yeah.
you know, and for those who don't know McKenna, he's an award-winning journalist. So he's asking that question as somebody who understands the business, and it's the frustration of it that we don't have an answer for it. I have conversations together with Trisha, with journalists who pass through Miami. They're on their way to another story, or they're on their way to a trip or whatever, and they work for one of the large outlets. And then we talk about the state of journalism. I wish that we could post a series of podcasts about the state of journalism. If those journalists who are employed now and get their checks from large companies would share the stories, and I'm not just talking about gender, but what I talk about this fitting into the orthodoxy of one thing, that you're on the right side of these issues, that you're an activist journalist, which goes against the very idea of what we were always trained. Our idea was you follow the evidence, follow the facts, and you come up with what it is. You don't know what your conclusion is until you do your research, but now people know what they want to say, and they look for information that supports it. That's not journalism, but that's how a lot of people operate. And I don't know what's going to change that. I don't know.
I don't know. It's upsetting and scary at the same time.
Yeah.
Okay.
It is, and I agree. And sorry, no, I'll let you move on because you've a long list here. But thank you very much, Trish and Gerald.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. We've got Aaron Friday. Let's see if Aaron can get on now. Okay, go ahead, Learning Mama. You're on.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep. Yes, we can hear you.
My question is kind of twofold, because you guys have a lot of experience with the pharmaceutical companies, and it seems like the pharmaceuticals have a hold on media, given all the direct consumer advertising that happens on television commercials and whatnot. And I feel like that's a big part of how we got here and why certain networks are silent on this issue. And then related to that, the marketing of this idea that you could be born in the wrong body being instituted in our educational systems under the guise of gender identity and the sex ed or the anti-bullying curriculum, has led kids to be confused and then puts them on the pipeline to the medical pathway with the gender affirmation. Because the social transition obviously is the first step in creating this false identity for children and young adults, because kids go away to college and then they're groomed in the social justice arena to go along to get along. And if you don't, you're a bigot or you're transphobic or you're a horrible person, which nobody wants to be labeled as. So I guess that's my broad comment question to you is, how, where do you stand on trying to fight that?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. You talked about this on Trisha on Pharma, the number of ads they run and everything else. They keep some things off the air. There's no question. I've done CBS This Morning, a Sunday morning program on 3 or 4 books in a row, not on Pharma. And if you watch their ads on their Sunday morning program, they're almost all drug companies.
Well,
so that's not a surprise.
I think also your other book, and I told you at the time, God Bankers, you could not get on.
Yeah,
the Catholic Church.
Yeah, so sometimes that does happen, but something very interesting when you mentioned social transitioning, which people who want to be liberal and progressive on the issue want to embrace social transitioning because they say, well, there is no harm to that because they're not taking drugs, they're not doing surgery. But what they don't realize is that the Dutch protocol, which was the original start with the Dutch researchers in 1998 for puberty blockers, those Dutch researchers, although they were completely wrong on pushing drugs as an alternative, they were against social transitioning because they said, if you use the pronouns that children want, if you allow them to dress in the clothes of the other gender, if you allow them to fit socially into that and you accept them at school as the other gender, then you will push them at a faster rate in the medical pipeline. And in order to make sure that we don't have false positives, kids who thought that they were another gender but they weren't, they said, we believe in puberty blockers, which I can disagree with for a whole bunch of reasons that have come out since, but we don't believe in social gendering because that's going to push them in there. And here in the US and in Europe until recently, we embrace the worst of all worlds. We have all the social transitioning, which we embrace fully, and then we have the medical transitioning right behind it. And I think that is really a problem. If anybody reads in the New York Times today, there's an op-ed by a psychiatrist, a guest essay. He's Jack Turbin is a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and he has been a gender advocate for a long time. If you want to get scared about where this goes next, he says he calls it a transcendent sense of gender. That means beyond language, people just feel male or female.
Right.
And it manifests itself in different ways. Well, if you start to tell kids it's how you feel, you know, I know we have got kids. I see them. One period they're absolutely crazy about dinosaurs, and 2 weeks later they can't be bothered about them, and they want to do something completely different. And it's the same here. If you start to listen to children about how they feel and have them make permanent decisions, it's a real problem.
Okay, I think Erin's having some connection problems. So
Can I do one thing for Erin?
please.
Okay. For Erin, I don't know if she'll like this or not since I've never spoken to her, but I think she'll like it. Those of you who are listening, if you call this telephone number, you can tell Gavin Newsom to veto the bill 1955 in California that will make it a crime for schools to tell parents that their children are transgendering. You call 916-445-2841. I'm taking that actually from a tweet that she has.
916-445-2841.
And I think Gavin Newsom is at a stage in his political career when he might even listen to voters outside of Florida or California about what they think. So let him know you don't think it's a good idea. You should veto it.
And people can call every day this week, because I think this is, if he does not veto it, then it will go into law.
That's right. And which is the we said before, the cowards in journalism who won't cover stories, right? The cowards in politics who will allow something to go through it and then be able to say later why I didn't sign it.
Someone just came on?
Yep, that's Erin. Do we have you now?
Oh,
Yeah, sorry, guys.
There we go.
hi, Erin.
Hi, Erin.
Hello. Thank you for being here and letting me speak. Yes, please call in about AB 1955. I mean, we really do have a shot of stopping this bill, because Gavin thinks he's going to replace Biden, and so he's in a
Exactly.
He's in a pickle. He has dodged this question whenever asked about parental rights to know. He'll switch over to the climate, so he doesn't want to deal with the issue.
The climate.
Yeah, I know, it's so related. And he's a proverbial politician, and he knows what the polling is, which, you know, even in liberal.
Oh no.
Oh no, I know.
No, we lost you, Erin. Here, hold the phone above your head. A window.
Can you guys
go to a window? Oh,
We
yeah.
can hear
You're
you.
back. There you go.
Can you
Can you hear me?
You were saying the
Anyway,
polling.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you. You were talking about the polling.
Yeah, so he's smart enough to know that 75 to 84% of all Californians, including Democrats, independents, are against school secrets. So he's no dummy, but you know, he's got his I call them the Dirty Dozen, the LGBTQ caucus, which are quite powerful. So we'll see what he does. He's got till the 12th. He could possibly just not sign it and let it go into law and kind of wash his hands of it, but he'll own it. So we'll see.
Yeah,
we'll see.
He will own it.
He
That's
will
a
own
very
it.
good
He
word.
will own it. We will never let him forget it. Can you repeat the phone number one more time so people have it?
Erin.
Gerald, do you have
yes,
it?
Yes, I do. Oh, yeah. Sorry. 916-445-2841.
Great.
And I encourage people to call daily, because they really love to hear from us.
We will.
There's a abrupt as can be. But I did want to later. I will be tweeting a thread of all of the graphs from all the different countries in the uptick of kids who are identifying as transgender. And I'll just bring a personal story in that when my daughter said that she was transgender, I said, okay, not my kid, everybody else's kid, but not mine. You know, that's the knee jerk reaction, being a nice little liberal and Democrat reading the New York Times and, you know, the Atlantic religiously. And then I looked at one graph. All I did was look at that Tavistock graph of the 5,000% uptick. And I was like, okay, all of this is made up. And when you layer all those graphs on top, when people talk about misdiagnoses, I'm like, how can you look at these graphs and see that the only growing demographic of trans-identified people is, you know, children?
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yep. Yep.
That's the demographic. You don't need science. You just need numbers.
Yeah, and Aaron, let me tell you, the part that is so disturbing, in addition, is that number that you will post is music to like pharmaceutical executives, because you'll get this. If you go to pharma companies, for the most part, they have 3 and 5 year projections of what their revenue is going to be, because they know what their drugs are selling. They have patents, and they know what drugs are in the pipeline that they think are going to get approved. Sometimes they get a surprise, the FDA turns them down. But for the most part, they have an idea for what their revenue looks like. What you have with trans is a complete new opportunity, a new revenue stream that wasn't there 10 or 15 years ago, which presents itself when they see the 5,000 number. They're sort of thinking of it as a new revenue stream for the future. And that is the most callous bottom line way of looking at it. But I know that's not to say they're the only ones doing it, but what we view as with horror, that increase in the number, and say, oh, that's a contagion, they look at it and say, that's a business opportunity.
Money, ka-chink.
Yeah.
Well, on that really cheery note, we're 7 minutes over. You know, for those of you who came in late or, you know, and just caught part of this, we'll be posting this to our YouTube channel and also to our website. If you want to listen to the whole thing, that'll come in the next week or so. And then also, please, if you haven't already, please join us. Go to diag.org. That's di-ag.org. Our power is in our numbers. We need our representatives to understand that we are not a small group, but we are just a silent majority. So please do join us. I want to thank, I know Eliza also wants to thank the Posners for speaking with us tonight. It's been a real pleasure, just a lot of fun. And so I appreciate it. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Hey, good night, everybody.
Good night.